Captain Sarah Mitchell pressed her gloved hands against the controls of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog. The massive twin engines hummed beneath her as she flew low over the Iraqi desert, the tan and brown landscape stretching endlessly below. It was March 2003, just days into Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the 354th Fighter Squadron had been tasked with close air support missions that would bring them dangerously close to enemy positions. Sarah had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old, watching fighter jets streak across the sky at an air show in Ohio. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had told her that flying was in their blood. But back then, women weren't allowed in combat roles. Times had changed, and Sarah had fought tooth and nail through flight school, proving herself again and again to instructors who questioned whether a woman could handle the physical and mental demands of combat flying. The Warthog wasn't the prettiest aircraft in the Air Force fleet, but Sarah loved everything about it. Built around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon that could fire 3,900 rounds per minute, the A-10 was designed for one purpose: destroying enemy ground targets and supporting troops on the ground. Its titanium armor could withstand significant damage, and its redundant systems meant it could keep flying even when severely damaged. Sarah had studied every bolt and wire of her aircraft, knowing that understanding her machine could mean the difference between life and death. As she approached the target area, Sarah's radio crackled to life. Ground forces were pinned down by enemy fire from a fortified position about 15 miles northeast of Baghdad. Iraqi Republican Guard units had established defensive positions in a series of concrete bunkers, and American soldiers were taking heavy casualties trying to advance. The mission was clear: eliminate the threat and give the ground troops a chance to move forward. Sarah banked her Warthog to the left, scanning the horizon through her heads-up display. Her wingman, Captain Mark Rodriguez, flew in formation beside her, their two aircraft moving like deadly shadows across the desert floor. They had trained together for 2 years, developing the kind of trust that only comes from countless hours of flying in formation, practicing emergency procedures, and pushing their aircraft to the limits during training exercises. The intelligence briefing that morning had been thorough but concerning. Enemy surface-to-air missile systems had been detected in the area, including older Soviet-era SA-6 and SA-8 systems that were still deadly effective against low-flying aircraft. The threat was real, but the soldiers on the ground needed immediate support. Sarah and Mark would have to fly low and fast, using the Warthog's superior maneuverability and armor to survive long enough to complete their mission. As they approached the target area, Sarah could see smoke rising from several locations on the ground. The concrete bunkers were positioned on a low ridge, giving the defenders excellent fields of fire across the approach routes that American forces would need to use. Through her targeting system, she could see muzzle flashes from machine guns and the bright streaks of rocket-propelled grenades being fired at advancing American positions. Sarah's training kicked in as she began her attack run. The Warthog dropped to just 200 feet above the ground, its engine screaming as she lined up on the first bunker. The aircraft's advanced targeting system locked onto the concrete structure, and Sarah squeezed the trigger on her control stick. The Ju-8 cannon erupted to life, sending a stream of 30mm depleted uranium rounds into the target. The bunker disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris, its defenders silenced forever. Mark followed immediately behind, his Warthog adding its firepower to the assault. The two pilots worked in perfect coordination, each covering the other as they made repeated passes over the enemy positions. The Republican Guard forces fought back desperately, their small arms fire and machine guns creating deadly streams of tracers across the desert sky. On her fourth pass, Sarah noticed something different. Her threat warning system began beeping insistently, indicating that an enemy radar system had locked onto her aircraft. Somewhere in the confusion below, an Iraqi missile crew had managed to get their system operational and was tracking her Warthog as she pulled up from her latest attack run. The missile launch came without warning. Sarah's aircraft shuddered as proximity sensors detected the incoming threat, but there was nowhere to run. The SA-8 surface-to-air missile streaked upward through the desert air, its guidance system locked onto the heat signature of her twin engines. Sarah threw her aircraft into a violent, evasive maneuver, releasing chaff and flares in a desperate attempt to confuse the incoming missile. The explosion, When it came, felt like being hit by a giant sledgehammer. The missile's warhead detonated just behind her left engine, sending shrapnel tearing through the Warthog's armored skin. Warning lights flashed red across her instrument panel as hydraulic fluid began leaking from damaged systems. The left engine was severely damaged, its temperature climbing rapidly toward dangerous levels. Sarah fought to maintain control as her aircraft bucked and shuddered in the turbulent air. The Warthog's legendary toughness was being put to the ultimate test, its redundant flight control system struggling to compensate for the damage. She could feel the aircraft wanting to roll to the left, the damaged engine creating an imbalance that threatened to send her into an unrecoverable spin. Mark's voice crackled over the radio, urgent and concerned. He could see the damage to her aircraft, the smoke trailing from her left engine and the obvious difficulty she was having maintaining stable flight. The mission was no longer about attacking ground targets. It had become a desperate race to get Sarah's damaged Warthog to safety before it fell from the sky. As Sarah struggled with her controls, she looked down at her instrument panel and noticed something that would later become legendary among fighter pilots. Despite the massive damage to her aircraft, despite the explosion that had nearly torn her Warthog apart, her tail number was still clearly visible on her display systems. It was a number that would soon become famous throughout the Air Force, a symbol of courage and determination that would inspire a new generation of pilots. The second missile came from a different direction, launched by another crew that had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah was still fighting to control her damaged Warthog when the proximity alarm screamed again, this time even more urgent than before. The Iraqi forces had coordinated their attack perfectly, timing the second launch for when she would be most vulnerable, struggling with a damaged aircraft and limited maneuverability. This missile found its mark with devastating precision. The warhead exploded directly beneath her aircraft, the blast wave lifting the 30,000-pound Warthog like a toy and flipping it inverted. Sarah felt herself pressed deep into her ejection seat as G-forces that should have been impossible for the sturdy A-10 to generate threw her around the cockpit. The aircraft's frame groaned and twisted under the stress, metal fatigue cracks spreading through critical structural components. Both engines were now severely damaged, their compressor blades shattered by debris from the explosion. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across her canopy in crimson streams, and the smell of burning metal and aviation fuel filled the cockpit despite her oxygen mask. The Warthog's legendary armor had saved her life, but it couldn't save the aircraft itself. Multiple warning systems competed for her attention as crucial systems failed one after another. Sarah's training took over even as her world turned upside down, literally. The aircraft was inverted, flying backwards at 200 feet above the desert floor, and every instinct told her to pull the ejection handles immediately. But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the knowledge that American soldiers were still fighting on the ground below, depending on pilots like her to keep the enemy suppressed. Maybe it was pure stubbornness, the same determination that had gotten her through flight school when others said she didn't belong. With movements that were more instinct than conscious thought, Sarah began the complex process of recovering her aircraft. The Warthog was designed to be controllable even with massive damage, and she used every trick she had learned during her years of training. The rudder pedals felt mushy under her feet, indicating damaged flight control cables, but they still responded to her inputs. The stick was heavy in her hands, requiring all her strength to move, but it moved. Slowly, impossibly, the Warthog began to respond. Sarah managed to roll the aircraft upright, the horizon spinning crazily outside her damaged canopy, before finally stabilizing in its proper position. She was still flying, but barely. The aircraft was bleeding altitude steadily, both engines running rough and producing a fraction of their normal thrust. Fuel was leaking from multiple punctures in her wing tanks, leaving a visible trail in the air behind her. Mark's voice cut through the static on her radio, professional calm, masking obvious concern. He had witnessed the second missile hit, seen her aircraft disappear in a ball of fire and smoke, and had been certain he was about to watch his wingman die. When Sarah's Warthog emerged from the explosion, still flying but obviously in serious trouble, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The nearest friendly airfield was Al Assad Air Base, about 90 miles to the west. Under normal circumstances, that would be a 15-minute flight for a healthy Warthog. With her damaged engines and leaking fuel, Sarah wasn't sure she could make it halfway. Her fuel gauges showed a steady decrease as precious JP-8 jet fuel streamed from her punctured tanks. At her current rate of consumption and loss, she had maybe 20 minutes of flying time left. But there was another problem that was even more immediate. The desert below was still hostile territory, controlled by Iraqi forces who would be very interested in capturing a downed American pilot. If she had to eject, her chances of survival would depend entirely on how quickly a combat search and rescue team could reach her position. In the current tactical situation, with enemy forces actively engaging American ground units, that rescue might take hours or even days. Sarah made a decision that would later be studied in flight schools and debated by aviation experts. Instead of ejecting immediately, she would try to nurse her dying aircraft toward friendly territory. Every mile she could coax from the Warthog would improve her chances of survival if she ultimately had to abandon the aircraft. It was a calculated risk, betting her life on her ability to keep a severely damaged machine in the air long enough to reach safety. The flight became a constant battle between pilot and machine. The Warthog wanted to fall from the sky, its damaged engine struggling to produce enough thrust to maintain level flight. Sarah had to use every technique she knew to keep the aircraft airborne, adjusting power settings constantly, using the aircraft's momentum, and what little lift her damaged wings could still produce. Mark stayed with her throughout the ordeal, his healthy Warthog flying protective formation beside her crippled aircraft. He provided a continuous stream of information about her aircraft's condition, things she couldn't see from her cockpit. The damage was extensive, large holes in both wings, the left engine trailing smoke and metal debris, hydraulic fluid streaming from multiple locations, and what appeared to be significant structural damage to the rear fuselage. As they flew west toward Al-Assad, Sarah's fuel situation became critical. Her gauges showed less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining, and the engines were consuming what little was left at an alarming rate. The mathematical calculation was simple and terrifying. She was going to run out of fuel before reaching the airfield. When that happened, the Warthog would become a 30,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic properties of a falling brick. The radio chatter increased as word spread about the damaged aircraft limping toward base. Air traffic controllers cleared all other traffic from Sarah's flight path. Emergency crews scrambled to prepare for a possible crash landing, and the base commander authorized the use of emergency procedures normally reserved for wartime situations. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A pilot fighting to save not just her own life, but proving something important about courage, skill, and determination. Through her damaged canopy, Sarah could see the landscape slowly changing from hostile desert to areas showing signs of American military presence. Vehicles moved along roads below, some clearly military convoys, others probably civilian traffic that had resumed as coalition forces secured various sections of the country. Each mile brought her closer to safety, but also closer to the moment when her engines would finally quit, and she would have to make the most important decision of her flying career. The first engine quit without warning, its final death rattle echoing through the cockpit as the damaged turbine finally seized completely. Sarah felt the Warthog lurch violently to the left as the thrust imbalance tried to send her into an uncontrollable spin. With one engine completely dead and the other running on fumes, she was now flying what amounted to a severely damaged glider, with the flight characteristics of a falling refrigerator. Her right hand moved instinctively to the engine restart procedures, following emergency checklists that had been drilled into her memory through countless training sessions. But even as she went through the motions, she knew it was hopeless. The engine hadn't just flamed out from fuel starvation. It had been physically destroyed by missile fragments. No amount of pilot technique could restart an engine that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The remaining engine coughed and sputtered, its power output dropping steadily as it consumed the last dregs of fuel from her damaged tanks. Sarah could feel the aircraft settling toward the desert floor, the rate of descent increasing as her remaining thrust disappeared. She had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before she would be forced to make a decision that every pilot dreads: stay with the aircraft and attempt a dead-stick landing, or punch out and trust her life to a parachute and the mercy of whoever controlled the ground below. Mark's voice crackled over the radio, calm but urgent. He was calling out her altitude and airspeed, information that Sarah could see on her own instruments but which became crucial when a pilot was dealing with multiple emergencies simultaneously. His presence was more than just tactical support. It was psychological comfort in what might be the last minutes of her life. No pilot wants to face their final moments alone. And knowing that Mark was there, witnessing her struggle and ready to guide rescue forces to her location, made the terror more manageable. The landscape below had changed dramatically during her desperate flight westward. Instead of empty desert broken only by occasional Iraqi positions, she could now see signs of American military presence. Convoy routes marked by vehicle tracks, temporary landing zones carved out of the sand, and the distant smokestacks of what her map indicated was a captured Iraqi industrial facility, now serving as a coalition logistics hub. She was getting close to friendly territory, but close wasn't the same as safe. Sarah's training had covered forced landings extensively, but always in the context of mechanical failures or weather emergencies. Landing a severely damaged aircraft in a combat zone, with the possibility of enemy forces nearby, added layers of complexity that no simulation could fully replicate. The Warthog was tough, designed to absorb damage and protect its pilot, but even the best aircraft had limits. Those limits were approaching rapidly. The second engine died with a mechanical shriek that Sarah felt as much as heard. The sudden silence in the cockpit was deafening after hours of engine noise, broken only by the whistle of wind through the holes in her canopy, and the various warning alarms that continued to demand her attention. She was now flying a glider, and not a very good one. The Warthog's thick wings and heavy construction meant that without engine power, it had about as much glide capability as a falling anvil. Emergency procedures that she had practiced dozens of times in simulators now became life-or-death reality. Sarah ran through her emergency checklists with mechanical precision, securing damaged systems, preparing for a dead-stick landing, and setting up her aircraft for what would either be a successful emergency landing or a high-speed crash that would test the Warthog's crash protection systems to their absolute limits. The decision of where to attempt her landing became critical. Military doctrine called for pilots to try to reach friendly territory whenever possible, but Sarah was rapidly running out of altitude and options. Directly ahead was a stretch of relatively flat desert that looked suitable for an emergency landing, but her map showed it was in an area of uncertain control. Coalition forces had advanced through the region days earlier, but intelligence reports indicated that scattered enemy units were still operating in the area. To her right, about 10 miles off her current heading, was a confirmed coalition checkpoint where American forces were established in strength. But 10 miles might as well have been 100 given her current rate of descent. She would be on the ground long before she could reach that sanctuary. The choice was simple: attempt a landing in possibly hostile territory, or eject and hope that rescue forces could reach her before enemy forces did. Mark's aircraft circled overhead as Sarah set up for what everyone hoped would be a survivable crash landing. His job now was to mark her position, provide overwatch during the landing attempt, and coordinate with rescue forces if things went badly. The radio chatter increased as word of her situation spread throughout the coalition air network. Combat search and rescue teams were already spinning up their helicopters, but everyone knew that help was still at least 30 minutes away. As Sarah lined up for her approach to a flat section of desert, she made a decision that would later become part of Air Force legend. Instead of simply trying to land her aircraft and walk away, she decided to attempt something that had never been successfully accomplished with a severely damaged A-10. She would try to perform a controlled belly landing that would preserve not just her life, but potentially save the aircraft as well. The Warthog's landing gear had been damaged in the missile strikes, and attempting to lower it might cause additional structural failure, but Sarah had noticed that her main gear indicators still showed green, suggesting that the landing gear mechanisms might still be functional despite the other damage. If she could somehow get the gear down and locked, she might be able to make an actual landing rather than a controlled crash. Working quickly but carefully, Sarah began the process of lowering her landing gear. The hydraulic systems that normally operated the gear were damaged, but the Warthog had backup systems specifically designed for situations like this. Manual gear extension was possible, though it required precise timing and no small amount of luck. As she worked through the emergency procedures, she could see the desert floor rushing up to meet her, each second bringing her closer to the moment of truth. The landing gear indicators flickered between green and red as Sarah worked frantically with the manual extension controls. The damaged hydraulic systems were providing intermittent pressure, just enough to partially extend the gear, but not enough to guarantee that it would lock in place. She could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly unstable as the asymmetrical drag from the partially extended gear created new handling challenges that demanded constant control inputs. With less than 500 feet of altitude remaining, Sarah made the decision that would define her career and earn her a permanent place in military aviation history. Instead of retracting the gear and accepting a belly landing, she committed to the landing gear extension, manually pumping the backup systems and using every technique she had learned about emergency procedures. The main gear thumped into place with a reassuring mechanical sound that she felt through the airframe, but the nose gear remained stuck in the partially extended position. Mark's voice cut through the static, providing a running commentary on her aircraft's condition as only another pilot could. The main landing gear appeared to be down and locked, but the nose gear was cocked at an odd angle that suggested either partial failure of the extension mechanism or structural damage from the missile strikes. Landing with the gear in that configuration would be dangerous, but it was still better than a belly landing in the desert. The approach to landing became a masterclass in pilot technique under extreme conditions. Sarah had to compensate for the asymmetrical drag, the reduced power from her dead engines, and the unpredictable handling characteristics of her damaged aircraft. The Warthog wallowed through the air like a wounded whale, responding sluggishly to control inputs and requiring constant corrections to maintain anything resembling a stable approach path. At 200 feet above the desert floor, Sarah could see her intended landing area clearly. It was far from ideal. Rough terrain marked by rocks, scrub brush, and the occasional larger boulder that could destroy her landing gear on contact. But it was relatively flat, and more importantly, it appeared to be unoccupied by hostile forces. There were no vehicles, no obvious defensive positions, and no signs of the enemy activity that intelligence reports had suggested might be present in the area. The final approach required every skill Sarah had developed during her flying career. With no engine power, she had only one chance to get the approach angle correct. Too steep, and she would hit the ground with enough force to destroy the aircraft and possibly kill herself. Too shallow, and she would not have enough energy to reach her intended landing area, forcing her to land short in terrain that looked even more dangerous than her chosen spot. As the Warthog descended through the last 100 feet, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The frantic activity of the emergency procedures was finished. Now it was simply a matter of flying the aircraft to the ground using basic pilot skills and hoping that the landing gear would hold up under the stress of an unpowered landing. Her hands on the controls were steady, her breathing regular despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The main wheels touched the rocky ground with a jarring impact that sent shock waves through the aircraft's structure. Sarah felt herself pressed forward against her restraint system as the Warthog's momentum carried it across the rough terrain at over 150 miles per hour. The damaged nose gear collapsed immediately, sending the front of the aircraft sliding across the desert floor in a shower of sparks and flying debris. For several terrifying seconds, it seemed as though the aircraft might break apart completely. The nose of the Warthog dug into the sandy soil, acting like a brake that threatened to flip the entire aircraft end over end. Sarah fought with the rudder pedals and what little aerodynamic control she still had, trying to keep the aircraft tracking straight as it slowed from landing speed to a walking pace. The aircraft finally came to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke, its nose buried in a small sand dune, its tail section pointing toward the sky at an odd angle. For a moment, the only sound was the settling of hot metal and the whistle of wind through the numerous holes in the aircraft's structure. Sarah sat in her cockpit, hardly believing that she was still alive, still conscious, and apparently uninjured despite everything she had been through. Mark's Warthog thundered overhead, making a low pass to assess the crash site and check on Sarah's condition. His relief was evident in his voice as he radioed that he could see movement in the cockpit and that Sarah appeared to be responsive. But the celebration would have to wait. They were still deep in potentially hostile territory, and the smoke from her crashed aircraft was visible for miles in every direction. Sarah began the process of shutting down her aircraft's systems and preparing for emergency egress. The cockpit checklist for a post-crash situation was relatively simple. Secure ejection seat, ensure survival equipment is accessible, prepare for immediate evacuation of the aircraft, and establish communication with rescue forces. But the emotional impact of what she had just accomplished was beginning to hit her as the adrenaline started to wear off. She had successfully landed a severely damaged A-10 Thunderbolt in a combat zone, an achievement that would normally be considered impossible. The aircraft around her was a testament to both the engineering excellence of the Warthog's designers and the skill of a pilot who had refused to give up when everything seemed hopeless. But more than that, she had demonstrated something important about courage, determination, and the kind of person who chooses to serve their country in the most dangerous situations imaginable. As Sarah prepared to climb out of her cockpit, she looked at her instrument panel one last time. Despite all the damage, despite the missiles and the crash landing, her aircraft's tail number was still clearly visible on her display systems. It was a small thing, but somehow it seemed significant. That number would soon become known throughout the military aviation community, not just as the identifier of an aircraft that had survived the impossible, but as a symbol of the kind of courage and skill that defined the best of American military aviation. Sarah climbed out of her cockpit onto the wing of her crashed Warthog, her legs unsteady after the harrowing flight and violent landing. The desert silence was profound after hours of engine noise and radio chatter, broken only by the occasional pop and creak of cooling metal. She could see for miles in every direction across the flat terrain, and right now that visibility was both a blessing and a curse. While she could spot approaching threats from a great distance, she was equally visible to anyone who might be looking for a downed American pilot. Her survival training kicked in immediately. First priority was establishing a defensive perimeter and getting away from the aircraft, which would be a magnet for both friendly and enemy forces. Sarah gathered her survival gear, water, emergency rations, signaling equipment, medical supplies, and her sidearm. The standard-issue survival radio would be her lifeline to rescue forces, but it also carried the risk of revealing her position to enemy interceptors, who monitored coalition frequencies. Mark's Warthog continued to circle overhead, but Sarah knew he couldn't stay forever. His fuel state would eventually force him to return to base, leaving her alone in the desert. Before that happened, they needed to establish communication protocols and coordinate with combat search and rescue forces, who were already en route to her position. The radio crackled as Mark relayed her exact coordinates and condition to the Rescue Coordination Center. Moving away from the crash site proved more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. The adrenaline that had sustained her during the emergency was wearing off, replaced by exhaustion and the physical strain of what she had endured. Every step across the rocky ground reminded her that she had just survived something that should have killed her, and her body was beginning to process the trauma of the missile strikes and crash landing. About 200 yards from her aircraft, Sarah found a position that offered some concealment behind a low ridge of rocks and scrub brush. From here she could observe her crashed Warthog while remaining hidden from casual observation. The aircraft looked even more severely damaged from the outside than it had felt from the cockpit. It was amazing that anything recognizable as an airplane remained, let alone something that had been capable of controlled flight. The wait for rescue began, and with it came the full realization of her situation. She was alone, potentially behind enemy lines with limited supplies and no way to defend herself except for her training and her pistol. Intelligence reports had indicated that irregular forces were still operating in the area, and the standing orders were clear: capture or kill any coalition personnel found in their territory. Sarah's radio came to life with updates from the Rescue Coordination Center. A combat search and rescue team was en route, but they were still at least 40 minutes away. Weather conditions were favorable, and Mark was providing continuous overwatch. But there were reports of enemy vehicle movements in the area that could complicate the rescue operation. She would need to stay hidden and maintain radio contact while avoiding detection by hostile forces. The psychological challenge of waiting proved almost as difficult as the physical ordeal she had just survived. During the flight, she had been too busy fighting for her life to think about anything except keeping her aircraft in the air. Now, with time to think, the full magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. She had been shot down, could have been killed, and was now stranded in hostile territory with her survival depending on the skills and courage of people she had never met. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah began to hear the distant sound of vehicles approaching from the east. Through her binoculars, she could make out a small convoy of trucks and possibly an armored vehicle, moving across the desert in the general direction of her crash site. The vehicles didn't match the profile of any coalition equipment she was familiar with, which meant they were either Iraqi military or civilian vehicles that might contain hostile forces. The convoy stopped about half a mile from her crashed aircraft, well within range to observe the wreckage, but far enough away to avoid any potential traps or booby traps that coalition forces might have left behind. Sarah watched as figures dismounted from the vehicles and began moving cautiously toward her Warthog. Through her binoculars, she could see that at least some of them were carrying military equipment and weapons. Mark's voice crackled over the radio, urgent but controlled. He had also spotted the enemy vehicles and was coordinating with higher headquarters about the developing situation. The rescue mission was now potentially compromised, as the helicopters would be flying into an area with confirmed enemy presence. Decisions would need to be made about whether to proceed with the rescue or wait for the situation to develop further. The enemy forces reached Sarah's aircraft and began a careful examination of the wreckage. She could see them pointing at various parts of the damaged Warthog, obviously trying to determine what had happened and whether the pilot had survived. The fact that there was no body in the cockpit would tell them that she had successfully evacuated the aircraft, which meant they would begin searching the surrounding area. Sarah's training included extensive instruction on evasion techniques, but the reality of putting those skills to use in actual combat conditions was far more challenging than any exercise. She needed to remain hidden while maintaining radio contact with her rescue forces, all while enemy troops searched the area around her position. The slightest mistake could result in capture, and intelligence briefings had made it clear that captured coalition personnel faced an uncertain fate. The radio brought mixed news. Combat search and rescue helicopters were still en route, but their arrival time had been pushed back due to the need to coordinate with attack aircraft that would suppress the enemy forces around the crash site. Sarah would need to remain hidden for at least another hour, possibly longer, while coalition forces organized a response to the changed tactical situation. As the enemy search expanded outward from the crash site, Sarah realized that her current hiding place might not remain secure for much longer. The search pattern being used by the hostile forces was systematic and thorough, suggesting military training rather than random civilian curiosity. She would need to move to a more secure location, but any movement carried the risk of detection by observers who were now actively looking for signs of a downed pilot. The sound of approaching helicopters reached Sarah's ears long before she could see them, a distinctive beating rhythm that every military pilot recognized instantly. But mixed with the familiar sound of American rotors was something else, the higher-pitched whine of jet engines at low altitude. The rescue package wasn't just helicopters. It included fighter escort and possibly attack aircraft to deal with the enemy forces that had gathered around her crash site. Sarah keyed her survival radio with the predetermined authentication codes that would identify her to the incoming rescue force. The response came immediately, professional and reassuring. The rescue coordinator confirmed her position, her condition, and began walking her through the procedures for a combat rescue in a contested environment. This wasn't going to be a simple pickup. It was going to be a military operation with all the complexity and danger that implied. The first aircraft to arrive weren't the rescue helicopters, but a pair of F-16 Fighting Falcons flying at extremely low altitude. Sarah watched as they made several passes over her position and the enemy forces, their pilots conducting visual reconnaissance and preparing for potential engagement. The sight of American fighters overhead was enormously comforting, but it also emphasized the seriousness of her situation. Combat search and rescue operations involving fast jets meant that intelligence considered the threat level to be significant. Mark's Warthog had been joined by another A-10 from their squadron, providing additional close air support capability if the situation deteriorated. The radio chatter increased dramatically as various aircraft coordinated their positions, attack angles, and rules of engagement. Sarah found herself at the center of a complex military operation involving dozens of personnel and multiple aircraft types, all focused on getting one downed pilot safely home. The enemy forces around her crash site had also noticed the increased air activity and were taking defensive positions. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see them deploying what appeared to be man-portable surface-to-air missiles, the same type of weapons that had brought down her Warthog hours earlier. The rescue was going to require precise timing and coordination to succeed without additional aircraft losses. The rescue helicopters appeared on the horizon as dark specks against the afternoon sky, flying in formation at low altitude to avoid detection and possible missile engagement. Sarah could make out the distinctive silhouette of an H-60 Pavehawk, specially equipped for combat search and rescue missions. Accompanying it was what appeared to be an attack helicopter, probably an Apache gunship, providing armed escort for the rescue aircraft. As the helicopters approached, the F-16s began their attack runs on the enemy positions around Sarah's crash site. The sound was deafening even from her concealed position several hundred yards away, as 20mm cannon fire and precision-guided munitions struck the hostile forces who had been searching for her. The attack was surgical in its precision, designed to neutralize the immediate threat without causing unnecessary destruction or civilian casualties. Sarah watched in awe as the rescue operation unfolded around her. The level of coordination, the precision of the attacks, and the obvious skill of all the aircrew involved demonstrated the effectiveness of American military training and equipment. But more than that, it showed the commitment of the military to never leave anyone behind. Regardless of the cost or complexity of the mission required, the rescue helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of sand and dust about 50 yards from Sarah's position, its crew chief already visible in the open door with a machine gun, ready to provide covering fire. Sarah sprinted toward the aircraft, keeping low to avoid the rotor wash and any possible enemy fire from positions that hadn't been neutralized by the attack aircraft. The distance seemed to stretch forever, but it was actually less than 10 seconds before she dove through the helicopter's door. The rescue crew was professional and efficient, immediately checking her for injuries while the helicopter lifted off and began evasive maneuvers to avoid possible ground fire. Sarah found herself surrounded by combat medics, rescue specialists, and door gunners who treated her with the kind of matter-of-fact competence that she associated with the best military personnel. To them, this was just another mission, albeit one with higher stakes than most. As the helicopter climbed to safety, Sarah got her first aerial view of the rescue operation that had been mounted to save her. The coordination was impressive. Attack aircraft maintaining overwatch, the escort helicopter covering their withdrawal, and fighter jets providing high cover against any possible air threats. The enemy forces that had been searching for her were either destroyed or scattered, no longer capable of threatening the rescue operation. The flight back to Al Asad Air Base gave Sarah time to process what had happened to her over the past several hours. She had been shot down, crash-landed a severely damaged aircraft, evaded capture in hostile territory, and been rescued by a complex military operation involving dozens of personnel. But perhaps most importantly, she had proven something significant about the capabilities of American pilots and the effectiveness of military training under extreme conditions. During the helicopter flight, one of the rescue crew members handed Sarah a message that had been passed along from higher headquarters. It was brief but significant. Her tail number, the identifying code that had remained visible on her aircraft displays throughout the entire ordeal, was being recommended for special recognition. The number that had somehow survived missile strikes, system failures, and a crash landing was going to become a symbol of resilience and determination throughout the Air Force. As Al Asad Air Base appeared on the horizon, Sarah began thinking about the debriefing sessions that would follow, the lessons that could be learned from her experience, and the impact her story might have on other pilots facing similar situations. But right now she was simply grateful to be alive, surrounded by fellow service members who had risked their own lives to bring her home safely. The debriefing rooms at Al Asad Air Base were filled with more people than Sarah had expected. Intelligence officers wanted every detail about enemy positions and capabilities. Flight safety investigators needed to understand exactly what had caused her aircraft to survive damage that should have been catastrophic. Senior commanders were interested in the tactical lessons that could be applied to future operations, but it was the group of F-16 pilots in the corner who would ultimately spread the story that made Sarah's tail number legendary throughout the fighter community. Captain Jake Morrison was the flight lead of the F-16s that had provided cover during Sarah's rescue. He had been flying fighters for 8 years, had seen plenty of combat, and considered himself pretty much unimpressible when it came to displays of pilot skill. But what he had witnessed during the rescue operation had left him genuinely stunned. He had watched Sarah's damaged Warthog limping across the desert, trailing smoke and debris, and had assumed he was about to witness a fatal crash. When Sarah's aircraft had disappeared behind a ridgeline during its final approach, Jake had been certain that the next thing he would see would be a ball of fire and smoke, marking the death of another pilot. Instead, he had flown over the crash site to find a relatively intact aircraft and clear evidence that the pilot had walked away from what should have been an unsurvivable landing. The precision required to accomplish that feat, under those conditions with that level of aircraft damage, was something Jake had never seen before. But it was the tail number that caught Jake's attention and sparked an idea that would change Sarah's life forever. Throughout the entire ordeal, from the initial missile strikes through the desperate flight to the crash landing, her aircraft's identification number had remained clearly visible. It was 820655, painted in regulation white letters on the vertical stabilizer of her Warthog. That number had survived everything the enemy had thrown at them, and somehow it seemed appropriate that it should become a symbol of the incredible events they had all witnessed. Jake began telling the story to other pilots in the squadron, emphasizing not just Sarah's skill and courage, but the almost supernatural toughness of the aircraft that had brought her home. The story grew in the telling, as good stories often do, but the core facts remained unchanged. A pilot had been shot down, had refused to quit, and had accomplished something that the aviation textbooks said was impossible. Within days, the story had spread throughout the coalition air forces operating in Iraq. Pilots are natural storytellers, and they recognized something special when they saw it. Sarah's achievement represented the kind of airmanship that every pilot aspired to, but hoped they would never need to demonstrate. The combination of technical skill, physical courage, and pure determination that she had displayed became the standard against which other pilots measured themselves. The formal recognition came through official channels, but the real honor came from her peers. Fighter pilots are notoriously difficult to impress, having seen enough genuine heroism that they can distinguish between luck and skill. When word spread that Sarah had been recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, the response from the pilot community was universal approval. She had earned it through demonstrated performance under the most challenging conditions imaginable. But it was tail number 820655 that took on a life of its own. Other pilots began requesting that number for their own aircraft, seeing it as a talisman that might bring them the same kind of luck and skill that Sarah had demonstrated. The Air Force, recognizing the morale value of the story, began featuring the number prominently in recruiting materials and training programs. It became a symbol of the kind of excellence that the service expected from its pilots. Sarah's story was eventually declassified and shared more widely, becoming a case study in survival training programs and a featured example in leadership courses. Military aviation schools around the world began teaching the tactical lessons from her mission, but they also emphasized the human factors that had made her survival possible. Technical knowledge and flying skills were important, but courage, determination, and the refusal to give up were equally crucial. The recovered wreckage of Sarah's Warthog was transported back to the United States, where engineers studied every piece of damage to understand how the aircraft had survived such extensive battle damage. Their findings led to improvements in aircraft design and survivability features that would protect future generations of pilots. The tail section bearing number 820655 was preserved and eventually displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where it continues to inspire visitors with its story of courage and determination. Years later, Sarah continued flying, eventually becoming an instructor pilot responsible for training the next generation of combat aviators. She never tired of telling her students that flying skill was important, but that the real test of a pilot came not in perfect conditions, but when everything went wrong. The aircraft would do its job, the support personnel would do theirs, but ultimately survival depended on the pilot's willingness to keep fighting when giving up seemed like the reasonable option. The F-16 pilots who had witnessed her rescue continued to spread the story throughout their careers, ensuring that tail number 820655 became legendary throughout the fighter community. For them, it represented more than just one pilot's remarkable achievement. It symbolized the kind of excellence and dedication that defined American military aviation. When young pilots asked what it meant to be a fighter pilot, experienced aviators would tell them about the day a Warthog pilot proved that determination and skill could overcome impossible odds. and how her tail number became a symbol of everything that was best about military aviation. The legend of 82-655 grew beyond the military community, inspiring civilians and military personnel alike, with its message that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when faced with extreme challenges. Sarah's story became proof that the right combination of training, courage, and determination could overcome even the most desperate circumstances, and that heroes were made not by seeking glory, but by simply refusing to quit when quitting seemed like the only reasonable option.